the Leon Panetta 2025 Lecture Series. What will be the legacy of the Trump era? This lecture discusses Constitution, immigration, law and order, pardons. What will be the law enforcement legacy of the Trump era? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome each and every one of you to the second discussion in the 2025 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. It's hard to believe. It's been quite a few years that we've been getting together. We're here live in Leon's hometown of beautiful Monterey at the wonderful Monterey Conference Center. Tonight, we continue our discussion on the Trump presidency and what history will say about its impact on our democracy. Our focus tonight is the rule of law. For nearly 250 years, our country has required the president and our highest elected and appointed officials to swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This president has issued executive orders and taken actions that raise concerns about his commitment to protecting the Constitution. There are over 182 cases that have been filed in the courts challenging many of the actions of this administration. The judicial system has responded as the courts work to protect the Constitution, Congress's ability to legislate and allocate federal funds, the right of immigrants to due process, and whether the orders of the courts should be followed. At risk is one of the fundamental pillars of American justice, the right of the judicial branch to interpret the law and require the other branches to abide by its rulings. The survival of our democracy depends on the rule of law. Should the courts preserve and protect our Constitution? Will Congress defend its power of the purse? Can the president determine which laws to follow and which court orders to obey? How do we restore respect for the rule of law? Secretary Panetta will pose these critical questions to a distinguished panel of experts on law enforcement. Our first guest had a prestigious legal career in the private sector and in both elected and appointed office. He served for over 2 years as an assistant U.S. attorney before being nominated by President Reagan as U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Alabama. He was later elected as Alabama Attorney General in 1995 and served until 1997 when he was elected to the United States Senate. He served as the senator for Alabama for 2 decades and was the ranking Republican on both the Judiciary and Budget committees. In 2017, he was sworn in as the 84th Attorney General for the United States during the first Trump administration, where he served until November 7th, 2018. Now, please welcome Senator Jeff Sessions.
Thank you. Good. Down this way.
Right there. Our next guest has had a career at the highest levels of the Justice Department. He served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Texas and Eastern District of Virginia, and later joined the staff of FBI Director Robert Mueller. In 2015, he became the acting administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He is now a respected legal commentator on a number of networks and news programs. Please welcome Chuck Rosenberg. Our third guest served as the president of the University of California from 2013 to 2020, as the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013, as governor of Arizona from 2003 to 2009, as Attorney General of Arizona from 1999 to 2003, and as U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona from 93 to 1997. At DHS, she led the nation's efforts to prevent terrorist attacks and secure its borders, and spearheaded the creation of the DACA initiative. She has said that she has seen the consequences of the nation's broken immigration system at every level. Please welcome Secretary Janet Napolitano. Our final guest was a political refugee from Cuba who began his career in public service in the Justice Department. After nearly 9 years as a federal prosecutor, he became the youngest United States attorney in the nation. He served as the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2016, and as the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services from 2009 to 2013. He would go on to become the first Latino and first immigrant to serve as Secretary of Homeland Security. Please welcome Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And of course, moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district, and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. You know, early in his career, he lost his job in the Nixon administration because he spoke out against an administration that was refusing to follow the rule of law. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the second lecture of the Panetta Lecture Series for 2025. The President's been in office a little more than 12 weeks, but during that time, he's conducted a number of unprecedented actions that raise legal, political, financial, and security issues. So what will history say about all of this as it looks at the legacy of the Trump era? Our last lecture looked at the economic area, particularly on tariffs, which still remain a big issue to be concerned about. Tonight, we look at the enforcement of law and our system of justice, because clearly a number of decisions by the administration have resulted in litigation. There's something like 182 to 200 court cases that are pending. Our democracy is based on the rule of law as defined by the Constitution. Because our founding fathers understood that the most important thing was that power should not be centralized in any one branch of government. We shouldn't have a king, we shouldn't have a king parliament, and we shouldn't have a star chamber court. And that's why they created three separate but equal branches of government, each a check and balance on the other. Why? To limit power. Limit power. Now, we've had presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, that did not like their power to be limited by the courts. Andrew Jackson refused to enforce a Supreme Court decision. Teddy Roosevelt said that the progressive movement cannot surrender to a judge. FDR tried to stack the Supreme Court because it was ruling against parts of his New Deal. And now Donald Trump wants to impeach judges who rule against him. But somehow, throughout it all, our democracy has survived. And tonight we will ask our panel of outstanding legal experts whether it will again, as it deals with executive actions, immigration, the power of the purse, federal spending, and of course, the Constitution. Let me begin by looking at the basics here of what we're talking about. Presidents and top elected officials in this country, I think all of us on this stage, swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. For the President, the Constitution also requires that he take care to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And we have often said that presidents are not above the law. But on President's Day this last year, the President said the following, and I quote, "He who saves the country does not violate the law," unquote. So my first question is, which is it? Which is it? Who decides what is constitutional, what is legal? In Marbury versus Madison, Marshall said it was the courts. Is it the president or the courts that decides constitutionality? Jeff?
Well, Marshall said it was the courts. And in that opinion, he used the phrase that it goes without saying that in America we are a nation of laws and not of men. The end of the Massachusetts Constitution says, to the end that the state of Massachusetts shall be a state of laws and not of men. It was a big deal at the time. So ultimately we have gotten to the point where we accept routinely almost the decisions of the highest court in the land, and presidents have whenever challenged. So obviously in the end, I can't, there may come a time where there'd be a constitutional crisis. If it was a big issue and the president refused to comply, it would be a big constitutional crisis. It should always be avoided whenever possible. But Donald Trump was elected to fix things. American people, I don't know about this room, but most of them around the country are not happy with their government. And the median income is, less than $80,000 a year in America, and those people don't have lobbyists and nobody's looking out for their interest. And so he's promised to shake the place up. And he's not a lawyer, and he pushes every day for some new agenda that he wants to get done, and always the lawyers are around, they got gazoodles of lawyers that are ready to sue the president, and they sue. And we got governmental unions that are suing the president. So these groups are out there. I'm just saying to you, this man takes seriously his commitment to make major reform in America, to make this country run more effectively and advance the interests of the people of the United States first. And that's what he tries to do. Now, he's pushing the limits every day. A lot of these things he says, you don't hear from him again. A lot of these things get into court and change. He wins some and he loses some. But so that's where we are. I don't think, honestly, that the greatest, I'm talking too long, but I just want to say to you, that we can never lose the constitutional order that we have. Billionaires, above all else, ought to know that they don't want laws not enforced and the Constitution adhered to. And the lowest, poorest person wants the laws adhered to. We've been able to do that for over 200 years. We need to keep at it, and we should never, ever forget that the prosperity and public safety and our liberty are at stake, and it's protected us to a degree no other nation in the world comes close, and that should never be eroded in all our political disputes that continue to occur.
Chuck?
Okay, I'm going to go full nerd on you here. but you started it because you brought up Marbury versus Madison. So John Adams is president till 1801. It's the first time in American history in a transition from one president to another that parties switched. Washington and Adams are Federalists. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, of course, is an anti-Federalist. And right before that transition, Marbury appoints a whole bunch of judges, Adams appoints a whole bunch of judges, including poor old Marbury, who never gets his commission, isn't happy about it, and sues under the Jefferson administration to become a judge. And so you're right. Chief Justice Marshall says in Marbury it is emphatically the province and duty of the court to say what the law is. And then he required Thomas Jefferson to do absolutely nothing, not to confer the commission on Marbury, because there's a fundamental flaw. And everyone knew it, at the time, knew what it was. And this is really full-bore nerd. Read Federalist 78, because Hamilton says that the problem is that the judiciary can't enforce its own orders. So while Marshall is declaring emphatically that the court gets to say what the law is, he requires Jefferson to do nothing because he knew the risk was that Jefferson would not follow the order of the court to confer the commission on would-be Judge Marbury. That's the legacy of Marbury versus Madison. Back then and today, we know that presidents follow the orders of courts because it's a norm. And that norm, Mr. Secretary, could disappear like that. I'm not saying it will. I'm not catastrophizing here. But the same flaw that Hamilton recognized in writing Federalist 78, the same flaw that Chief Justice Marshall recognized in opining in Marbury, we are living with that today. Right? We expect presidents to obey the law. Presidents have mostly obeyed the law. But what if they don't? And so does the court get to say what the law is? They sure do. Will a president obey it? They typically have. Will they tomorrow? Stay tuned.
Nice to see.
Janet?
Well, I'm going to de-nerd this and say, look, the foundational document of our country is the Constitution, and the courts are charged with interpreting the Constitution, and it's the norm that the executive branch takes its direction from the court. And if the executive branch does not take its direction from the court, then we have what can be called a constitutional crisis, but we also have moved along the way from a democracy to an autocracy. And that is something that I don't think the average American will tolerate.
Alejandro?
Secretary, I'll just add a case in point. The president has issued executive orders directed at some of our nation's most prestigious and largest law firms. 3 different courts have ruled that those executive actions are actually contrary to law. And since the issuance of those rulings, temporary restraining orders that have restrained execution of the orders, the president has continued to issue executive orders against other law firms. This will be tested, possibly by the ultimate arbiter of the constitutionality of presidential action, the Supreme Court. But we do need to take note of the fact that courts have spoken with one voice, and yet that voice has not been adhered to.
Well, let me go ahead, Jeff.
You know, as Attorney General, you represent the executive branch, which is a co-equal branch. An executive branch in Congress does not take its direction from the Supreme Court. And I think in Marbury versus Madison, I mean, the Supreme Court has the power to declare an action, Congress or President, to be unconstitutional and unlawful. But I guess what was most important thing I want to say is Trump pushes the limit sometimes, but sometimes the courts have gone over the limits too. And they have a duty to show restraint and respect for the legislative and executive branches also. And they used to do that more than they do today. And that could lead us to a confrontation that we ought to try to avoid.
Well, let me take you to that point just to discuss it, because you know we're not there yet. But what happens if the Supreme Court orders the president to do something, fines against the president, and the president refuses to obey what the Supreme Court did? That's a crisis. We all admit that's a crisis. Yeah. But take me through it. What happens in that situation? How do we break that crisis? What takes place to force it?
Jacques, you started.
Oh, I did. It's all my fault.
No, it's really a good analysis. That was a good analysis he gave us.
There were times, Mr. Secretary, when that happened. Presidents have failed to abide court orders. I mean, Lincoln during the Civil War suspended the writ of habeas corpus. It was only after he did it that Congress approved that suspension. And we've had, I think, in more recent history, we came close, or at least I think we came to a point that was dangerous when the Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to surrender tapes and documents to a special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, during the Watergate investigation. Somewhat miraculously, Nixon, and it was an 8-0 decision, it was unanimous, I think one justice recused, Nixon abided that order. But what if he hadn't? And maybe he's held in contempt. So what? Remember, the executive branch enforces judicial orders. The judiciary, Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the judiciary. They have no enforcement authority, right? So if a court issues an order, maybe it's the U.S. Marshal Service that serves the papers or makes the arrest, or the FBI or the DEA, what have you. That's all part of the executive branch. So I think, you know, and again, I don't tend to catastrophize, and I'm really not a pessimist, despite everything I'm going to say tonight. But that is a crisis. We're not there yet. I hope we don't get there. President Trump has said a couple of different things. One that you quoted, right? If the president does it, essentially, it's okay. He also said the other day that he respects the Supreme Court. I think the answer, unfortunately, is we shall see whether or not that's true.
Let me ask you, I mean, because I think the ultimate answer here probably is the American people.
Yeah.
In some way, or a force. There are other checks in our system besides the courts. The president imposed the tariffs on trade, promising a stronger economy. Most economists, CEOs, Wall Street Journal said it would be a disaster. The markets were hit. There was a crisis in the bond market. There was a fear of recession, a fear of prices going up dramatically. And it forced the president to then pause the tariffs for 90 days, except for China. Our economic or political pressures or pressures from the American people a more effective check on this president than court orders? Janet, what do you think?
I think they very well could be, just because of the background of this president. He comes out of a business background. He's a real estate guy. He does deals. The reports were that in the first term, he paid a lot of attention to the stock market, and he talked a lot about the stock market. The reports from last week are that he was not paying so much attention to the stock market. Maybe not. But certainly he was paying attention to the bond market. And then we saw the pause. Interestingly enough, most of our presidents have been lawyers. Nixon was a lawyer. But Trump comes to the position having a pure business background. And anybody in a leadership position, your decisions are influenced by your own experiential basis. We're human beings, and you make decisions guided and informed by that. So it does seem to me that when we're evaluating President Trump, you got to look at the economics first.
Secretary, I'm not sure that
Go
it's,
ahead, Alan.
if I may, I'm not sure that it's comparative. I think they are different sources of pressures that work on different factors and certainly at different tempos. And so some are political, some are economic. The check of judicial authority is a mandate. The others are very different, I think, phenomena.
Jeff, let me ask you something. You served as Attorney General and head of the Justice Department. And I think it's clear, at least the tradition for an Attorney General is someone who's independent and enforces the law without regard to politics. You followed that tradition when you were Attorney General and paid a price. Loyalty has become the primary test, obviously, in this cabinet. What we're seeing is that in the Justice Department, for example, the Office of Legal Counsel, which basically is supposed to comment on the legality of executive orders, doesn't do it anymore. It's been pushed aside. Career employees, career lawyers at the department are being replaced by political people from Washington. You were Attorney General. What are the consequences of what's happening now in terms of the role of Attorney General in our system of government?
Well, I thought I understood it exactly right. When I was 12 years as the United States Attorney. I spent 20 years in the Senate on Judiciary Committee with oversight over the Department of Justice. And I had no problem separating the political and policy questions from the legal questions. Now, I don't claim to be a smart lawyer like Janet and them, but I would just say that I didn't have any real problem with that. Attorney General is part of the President's cabinet. He serves at the pleasure of the President of the United States, and the Attorney General should assist the President in accomplishing his lawful policies. So that, I didn't have any problem with that. So my little deal was that I was on the campaign committee submitted to the Federal Election Commission as chairman of as an officer of the Trump campaign, and they were investigating, we find out, the Trump campaign. So this is just basic lawyer 101, that you can't investigate a corporation of which you were an officer. And we had a special rule within the Department of Justice after Nixon, too, on ethics about not investigating political campaigns that you were a part of or had an interest in. So to me, it was just not hard to make that decision. The president really was disappointed because he predicted and feared that he was going to be dragged through the mud for years, and his whole presidency was at stake. So I submitted my resignation to him, I didn't write about it, but Reince Priebus wrote all about it. He get pretty correct. You know, I mean, I just said, well, I mean, I hadn't been there, what, 2 months? I appreciate the honor to serve. I'll submit my resignation, Mr. President. Thank you. And so I left, and they had all this, don't do it, this will be a terrible thing. So anyway, I submitted it. But so to me, that was the way the system ought to work. And all he had to do was say to me, you're gone, and I was gone. I didn't have to submit a resignation. That's the way the chief executive works. So I tried to do that. Now you get into circumstances, so I knew I shouldn't do that. That's just basic. I was a prosecutor for 14 years. I knew you can't have a conflict of interest and whatever. So how do we get, where does that leave us? Well, the Attorney General is not doing their job if they don't warn the President, lay out the dangers, and make sure there's a full understanding of what the law is on a complex subject. Sometimes it's vague. You know, if it's vague enough, you can defend the President. You prosecutors have heard the old saying that you should defend the state law or U.S. law unless it's so bad you have to throw up. It's called the throw-up rule. If you can argue the case without throwing up, you should defend the law or the President's agenda. Somebody needs, you're his lawyer, nobody else can defend him. Somebody needs to say why he thought he did the right thing. So it's a complicated world. A lot of judgment is involved in it. And I think it would be a mistake if the cabinet members and others don't help the President avoid overreaching and getting into trouble.
Chuck?
Yeah, so
You were in the Justice Department.
for many years, although this is the first time I've ever heard of the throw-up rule.
That's an old rule. I don't know where you've been.
Well, maybe the first time I've heard it phrased that way. But let me say a word about independence. So General Sessions is absolutely right. The Attorney General is part of the President's cabinet. The Justice Department is part of the executive branch. And so we talk about this independence thing, which, by the way, I think I benefited from as a line AUSA for decades. But the Department of Justice is not wholly independent. I can think of 3 ways right off the top of my head. One, it's completely appropriate for the Department of Justice to help a president of either party, any party, to vet judges, select men and women to be on the federal bench that align with the president's philosophy. Republicans, Democrats, doesn't matter. That's one role of the Justice Department that isn't independent of the White House. The Department of Justice also advises the president on legal policy. Or maybe the president comes in with a certain set of enforcement priorities, and the Department of Justice coordinates that with the White House, and I think that's fine. And a third way, you know, when we talk about independence, we're really talking about investigative and prosecutive independence, right? That you don't tell the FBI who to investigate. Right. But even there's a caveat or an asterisk. In national security investigations, and I took part in some very sensitive national security investigations, counterintelligence investigations, espionage work, it might be appropriate to tell the president what you're doing, because he, and I hope one day very soon she, right, is dealing with foreign counterparts or has to make decisions that touch on diplomacy and foreign affairs. And you don't want to surprise the president by arresting, you know, Russian operatives in New York City on a Tuesday when he's going to Moscow on a Wednesday. So, you know, there are ways in which it is absolutely appropriate to coordinate the work. The work that's not appropriate to coordinate, though, is the nuts and bolts investigative and prosecutive work. You don't target people that you don't like. You don't seek retribution. That's remarkably dangerous. And so when we talk about independence, that's what I think about. And those other things, right, that is what you normally see, that work, because it is also, as the general said, part of the executive branch.
Right.
And that reveals, you know, the problematic nature of, for example, President Trump signing 2 executive orders that by name list 2 people from his first administration who later became anti-Trump, so to speak, and directed that they be investigated by name. We haven't really seen, I have never seen that kind of action before. And it's a little bit analogous then to the campaign against law firms that have taken positions or have had lawyers on their staffs who have taken positions against the administration and barring them from entering federal buildings, canceling their security clearances, going after their clients and so forth. But the business that we saw last week was a first time where he spelled out 2 specific people. And if the Justice Department doesn't resist and say, well, you know, we have no predicate for that, it's not appropriate, they will undergo the cost, expense, and all the emotional things that go into being the subject of a federal investigation.
Yeah.
But it is appropriate, just to be clear, for the president to set his administration's policies, including the policies that govern the Department of Justice. I remember when I was the United States Attorney, the Attorney General received, then Janet Reno, received direction from the president as to what the president's priorities were in terms of the types of cases that should be the areas of focus. And we executed accordingly. That is perfectly appropriate. To Chuck's point, who the targets of criminal investigations in each of those areas is a matter of fact, a matter of evidence that the Department of Justice controls exclusively.
Well, we've had some real problems. One of them is I haven't heard many of my Democratic colleagues complain about New York, but it was like Beria told Stalin, you give me the name, I'll find the crime. You got a president of the United States being dragged through months of effort over a case that I think is not justifiable. And the Mueller investigation went much longer than it should have ever gone, putting a cloud over the president's ability to execute his office. Nobody ever wants to talk about that. So I think this is a matter we got to be careful about, and the thing goes on both sides.
Yeah, but you're not saying if a president violates the law that a president shouldn't be prosecuted.
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I think the Supreme Court said
How
that.
long did it take them to find? They had a duty, the Department of Justice, on the Russiagate, to bring that to a conclusion as soon as possible. And with regard to the case in New York, it looks to me like there was a lot of legal scholars said there's no case here at all. Nobody else had been prosecuted for that. He was president of the United States, and they basically said, you elect me DA, and I'm going to get him. Now, that's not right.
If I may, just 2 points, perhaps on the other side of this argument.
Yeah, try what the other side is, Chuck.
Well, the New York case was brought by a state authority, not by the United States.
Well,
Department
who
of Justice.
sat at the table? The Attorney General's own deputy.
No.
Who was it?
I don't believe that's
He
true,
wasn't
but
still deputy, but they resigned and went over there and tried the case.
it was brought by a state authority. But
Was it right or wrong? That's the question. Not saying it was federal.
all right, well, we'll finish that one backstage. But the other point, Bob Mueller was appointed by the Trump administration as special counsel. He wasn't appointed by Mr. Trump's successor or predecessor.
He was appointed by Rod Rosenstein, and I thought he would be a good choice. Not like the choice that they chose to investigate Trump. Mueller had an impeccable reputation of an independent person.
Deservedly so, but
But he did, I say, and I knew Bob a long time, I'd say it went much longer than it should have gone.
fair enough, although I disagree. Having done counterintelligence work, those are extraordinarily complex and sensitive cases. It's not like prosecuting a bank robbery where you get some fingerprints off the teller station and a video feed. You have to coordinate all of your work through the intelligence community, writing that report, which is required by the special counsel regulations, is an arduous process. And I know this will sound crazy to folks out in the audience, but bringing that thing home in 2 years is moving very, very fast in the federal investigative world.
All right, let me move on to immigration, if I could. Alec, let me ask you on immigration.
I'm afraid I've run out of time. And I'm going to...
When I was in the Congress, we really did have a very strong bipartisan effort to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and we did in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Since that time, there's no question that immigration has become broken. Congress has failed to act and pass comprehensive reform of any kind. Presidents have resorted to executive orders to try to deal with it. Biden ultimately issued executive orders. He failed at first, but then actually did some good things to try to control it. Trump has obviously targeted deportation. How did the situation get so bad on immigration that it really became not only a heavy political issue in the last campaign, but the American people were obviously concerned about efforts to try to control the border again? What happened? What brought us to that moment?
So, Secretary, let me say one thing first, which is you correctly identify our immigration system as terribly broken. And I'll give two examples of that. There are three objectives to our immigration system: humanitarian relief, economic prosperity, and family unity. Let's take economic prosperity. To the north, Canada admits each year the number of migrants that it needs to serve its labor market, and the number of migrants that, outside of the humanitarian context, the number of migrants that it admits year to year are set by market forces. Our numeric limits were set in 1996 and haven't moved since. And we need legislation to calibrate our system in the delivery of economic prosperity according to market forces. On the issue of humanitarian relief, when an individual arrives at the border and claims fear of persecution, which is a claim of asylum, there's a deliberately low threshold that has to be met for fear that we might return, and this is a matter of law, for fear that we might return someone to their place of persecution. So I'll generalize, approximately 70% of the people who claim credible fear of persecution actually succeed in meeting that initial threshold. The ultimate threshold for asylum to prevail ultimately in the court proceeding is a higher threshold. Approximately 20 to 25% qualify for that ultimate threshold. The time in between the credible fear determination and the ultimate merits determination is 7 to 10 years.
Is how 7 to
7 to 10 years. Our immigration courts are backlogged, and people they receive work authorization. Many have U.S. citizen children. And then 7 to 10 years later, if they actually do not prevail, it becomes very difficult to go into the community and to apprehend a family. President Biden took executive action in June of 2024, too late. Because what the American people saw was thousands of people arriving at our border every day, entering the United States, gaining work authorization, regardless of whether their claim of asylum would ultimately prevail, and that is broken. President Trump has taken the post-June 2024 success and actually made it even more successful through the dedication of resources to the border. The situation at the border has brought to the fore how broken our system is, how much it needs to be fixed, the resources that need to be dedicated to it, and we are in dire need of legislative action, which is the enduring solution.
Well, let me raise.
Well, I was going to say, it will be interesting to see once you have control of the border, and I agree with Ali. The steps taken there have greatly reduced the numbers, and they're expensive, et cetera, but they were necessary. The next issue is, what do we do with interior enforcement? The president has proposed mass deportations, initially for those who had serious criminal convictions, et cetera, but those guidelines seem to have disappeared, and we're now seeing increasing instances where people have been deported to other countries by mistake. People have been picked up on streets, particularly some students, and put into deportation, and their student visas canceled. And at a certain point, one wonders whether the American people will say, well, wait a minute, people deserve an opportunity for notice and an opportunity to be heard before they're removed from the United States, particularly long-term immigrants in the country. I don't know how those politics shake out, but I think once people have confidence in the border, the issues about how the interior enforcement is being conducted will become more relevant.
Could I ask,
Go ahead.
it could take too long, don't be long, but this, like 75% of the people are denied the refugee status at initial appearance.
Asylum status, yeah.
Ultimate determination, that's a
What
generalization.
what about the initial? It's about 75 on that too, as I recall. And are they, I don't know, I'm just asking, are they deported or do they appeal the initial determination and remain in the country to get some trial that comes up later?
So, to be clear, they make their claim of credible fear, that initial threshold, about, I'm generalizing, about 70% qualified, depends what country one is from,
Well, I
etc.
thought 70% were denied.
No, 70% make that initial threshold, pass it, and then 7-10 years later,
It wasn't under the Trump
They're-
administration. More of them were denied. But anyway, a substantial number were not denied, and a substantial number are turned down.
yes.
And do they then get to, what happens if they're not denied? Are they in the country that they've entered illegally permanently?
If their claim is approved, then they are granted asylum, and they have a basis to remain in the United States.
But if they aren't, because they've had
they are-
kids or a job, it's difficult.
It becomes difficult,
Yeah.
But they are subject to removal. And I must say, if they've had their due process and they've lost their claim, they should be removed.
Okay.
I just would say that because it's very difficult for the border. This is Homeland Security, they handle all this. It wasn't Department of Justice. But it's hard to get these things done, and then you end up with countless hours. And I guess the Congress could help to clarify this, expedite this process. Now,
With money and reform.
Well,
really.
in June of 2024, President Biden issued a proclamation. We promulgated a regulation that applied expedited removal to the process. It accelerated the adjudication process. It raised the bar for that initial threshold. But that is through executive order, and that is not enduring. We need legislation to fix the asylum system.
Could I be
Let me-
real brief on one point?
Yeah,
The
please.
big issue is Chuck Grassley supported Reagan's '86 amnesty bill, and they were promised that enforcement would follow. Chuck said, "I'll never do that again. It was a mistake. We got the amnesty and no enforcement."
And no enforcement.
That still remains.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, that still remains the reason we've been unable to settle immigration, because people like myself dug into it and did not believe the laws would be effective. So
Let me,
this is a hard. The Canadian system has got some real merit to it. We should consider it, as you note.
We're at the halfway point, and we're going to go to the questions from the audience. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team. These are the people who are responsible for selecting the questions that will be presented to the speakers, and I ask you to hold your applause until I introduce the entire group. They are Mike Clancy, KSQD, FM 90.7, David Kellogg, who's the managing editor of the Monterey Herald, Doug McKnight, interim general manager of KAZU Radio, and Pete Waversky, who's the managing editor of the opinion page of the San Francisco Chronicle. Would you thank them for the work they're doing? Sylvia and I also want to take this moment to thank all of the Panetta Institute Board of Directors and all of the sponsors of the lecture series that make these programs possible and allow us to share these important discussions with all of you, our audience, watching at home, and with the students that we have attend our student program from across Central and Northern California. If you would give our sponsors a hand, I would appreciate it. Sticking with immigration for a moment, this one's directed at you, Janet. How would you assess the state of DACA today? Has it accomplished the goals that you envisioned? What do you think is going to happen with the DACA program?
Well, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was a policy we adopted at the Department of Homeland Security. It was announced by the president in the Rose Garden to deal with the issue of young people brought here, typically under the age of 6, who had grown up in the United States, lived in the United States, had gone to school in the United States, were going to college, wanted to work somewhere in the military, but they were undocumented. And under the notion of prosecutorial discretion, we made the decision that this was the lowest priority group of people who should be worried about being deported and having to look over their shoulders to see whether there was an ICE agent. And we also made the decision that if they went through an approval process, if they paid a fee, if they had no criminal record, et cetera, they would get a several-year deferral of deportation, and with that could come a work authorization to deal with the issue of young people having to be paid under the table in cash or whatever to get work authorization. At its peak, DACA had about 850,000 young people in it. The Trump administration, first term, tried to rescind it. The University of California, I was then president, we actually opposed the rescission. We filed a lawsuit. I think we were the first in the court on that. I think I'm the only cabinet secretary who has sued her successor by name. But anyway, the Supreme Court ultimately agreed with us, not on the legality of DACA itself, but that the process used to try to rescind it was improper. And they sent it back. What happened then was a decision was reached that anybody currently in DACA could continue, but no new enrollees would be allowed in the program. Since then, there's been some other court actions and so forth, but I think that's basically the status now. If you've been in DACA, you can continue to renew your status, but no new applicants have been accepted.
Okay. The president signed an executive order to get rid of birthright citizenship but it is provided for in the 14th Amendment. Isn't the effort to get rid of birthright citizenship blatantly unconstitutional?
I think, I'll go ahead. I think it's part of a litigation strategy by the administration in this way. I think there has been a belief by some, that the 14th Amendment does not extend to the children of undocumented immigrants, despite its language. So Trump wants to get that in front of the Supreme Court. How does he do it? He issues an executive order. There are lawsuits filed in the federal trial courts. Federal trial courts enjoin the executive order, goes up to courts of appeal. They affirm the injunctions. But it's all a mechanism to get the issue before the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where I think we'll see final resolution of this.
And we have seen the Supreme Court overturn prior Supreme Court precedents.
Well, yes, the Supreme Court did say in the 1890s that it was not, the Constitution did apply, and that you could not end birthright citizenship. But there's some ambiguities about that were nowhere addressed. And people like Ed Meese, 20 years ago, it seemed like to me, wrote a long piece saying that he did not think that birthright citizenship was required. It surprised me, because I just assumed it did. You just read it at first glance. So I think there is some legitimate question there, and it will be before the Supreme Court. I'm sure the president will comply if he does not win.
You know, it may just be worth stating what the ambiguity is, what this whole fuss is about. So if you read the 14th Amendment, the notion of birthright citizenship is tethered to this phrase. Those, this first part is just me, not the Constitution. You know, those born in this country and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's the phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. What does that mean? And we've always taken it to mean, as you described, General, other than the children of diplomats, and that's clearly folks not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, so their children are not birthright citizens. Other than diplomats, anyone else born physically in this country is a citizen. And so Janet's exactly right. This is a litigation strategy. They're challenging the prior interpretation, the 1895-98 Supreme Court decision in which birthright citizenship was sort of decided. And the Supreme Court, I imagine, one day relatively soon will re-examine what it means to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and will determine whether the 1890 precedent holds or there's a new rule that's subject to the jurisdiction of does not include the children of those here unlawfully.
Let me ask a question on the power of the purse. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in the consequence of appropriations made by law. At the present time, the President, Elon Musk, the Department of Government Efficiency are freezing, withholding, and otherwise determining how federal funds will be used. Is that not a violation of the law?
Well, you didn't mean to say President Elon Musk, did you?
No, that's President
President, well, he has an ego almost as big as the president, so I
think you're right.
Look, Elon Musk, in my understanding of it, although they have not made this clear, but it's clear to me if you examine it, is an extension of the president, extension of his executive branch. He's making advice and recommendations and discovering allocation of monies. And remedies will have to be executed through the Office of Management and Budget and the Cabinet Secretaries. He does not he does not have any statutory status as an independent oversight agency to control expenditures. And this man well knows how it operates. And you are right that Congress alone can appropriate money. And that's one that's never been much evaluated or much undermined, and one of the great principles that you've clearly stood for and others have too.
Well, is it a fact that what they're recommending, if it's going to become law, has to be approved by Congress?
Yes.
Am I right?
Absolutely. I can't overstate how prescriptive Congress is in how departments and agencies are able to spend their money. In the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Napolitano and I live this. A set amount of money is dedicated to a particular purpose within an agency. We can't move that money at our discretion to a different purpose, regardless of how we would seek to prioritize the mission. We have to follow congressional directives as to how we are to spend the money, precisely how they have dedicated it. We can move a small percentage of it at our discretion, but no more than that. And then if we want to, we have to seek Congress's approval. Here, we're seeing money reallocated, funds used in different ways, and contrary to the appropriations that Congress has legislated by law. And so it's very difficult to understand how that comports with the legal framework of the budgeting process.
Here's my question. You know, Leon, you were in the House. Senator, you were in the Senate. Where is Congress as the president and DOJ do this? It's their power that is being impinged upon.
No, I can assure you that there was a time when Congress would not allow that to happen because it violates their power. Jeff remembers him, Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who was chair of the Appropriations Committee, would not allow anybody to take away that authority from the Congress. And that's what needs to happen now, is the line needs to be drawn in order for that to happen. Look, I think this, you know, I believe in efficiency, I believe in savings, but there's a right way to do that and a wrong way to do that. The right way is to follow the law. You know, when I was director of OMB, I worked with Bill Clinton. We went through, he wanted to get $500 billion in deficit reduction. We went through every section of the budget. We cut some programs. We added money to other programs, but we got $500 billion in deficit reduction. It was put into the budget. We sent the budget to Capitol Hill. The Congress approved the budget, and we got it done. That's the way you're supposed to do it. That's the way you're supposed to do it. You know, and that's the problem. We're not, you know, there's a right way to do this. And, you know, it can be done. It can be done.
We need to get on with it.
One
thing I'd say, if you find out that there are a bunch of dead people, must computers find getting money, do you still keep sending the money?
I
I mean,
think
that's kind of the things he's doing. He's not firing people by name. Others are. Is he?
Yeah, but Jeff,
I don't think he's firing them.
You can't.
He's recommending, and others are executing.
You can't have an individual decide to cut money from Social Security without going through Congress.
No, I mean, if you.
But that's what he's doing.
Not if they're sending money to people that are dead.
Look, that's against the law. That's
I know
against
it
the law.
is, but nobody's finding
and that should be
them.
enforced.
I think it's exaggerated. I don't think they're finding near as many as
No,
they say.
I don't either.
But I don't have any doubt that people, because I prosecuted the cases as the United States Attorney, where people took the money of their dead parents for years.
Let
I mean,
me,
this is a
and if
common
I-
sense
if I
way
might
to
add,
deal with it.
you know,
Janet?
one consequence about how this is all going down, Doge and so forth, and I've been thinking about this. So when Congress does a budget, I mean, it is the product of a lot of negotiation and compromise. Different people from different parties want different things. And when they end up with the final agreement, then they each rely on that's going to be the agreement. If we have a system where the president can decide, well, that's what may be in what was passed, but I'm just not going to spend that, or I'm going to gut this department, I'm going to remove all these people. Where's the incentive for anybody to negotiate a deal if the executive can just rewrite it at whim? So to me, this is an issue not only of the Congress's power of the purse, but Congress's actual power to legislate.
Well, Janet, you are correct. As I recall, the Supreme Court ruled presidents couldn't impound money. So if this is what the president's doing, he's going to lose, is he not?
He should.
He will. He will. If it isn't an impoundment, I'm sure they're going to have new arguments and new arguments to why it's legitimate.
There's a lot for the courts to decide here. Should the Justice Department have opened up an investigation into what's called here the Yemen group chat, which I think refers to
Signalgate.
the attack plan that was discussed on the open internet that should not have been discussed? It's an affair. Is it proper now to determine who was responsible for doing that, and shouldn't that individual be punished? Anybody want to comment?
Yeah.
Chuck?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. So my working theory here, Mr. Secretary, is that we saw one such instance of a leak, maybe of classified information, certainly of defense information, absolutely of sensitive information. I assume, most people, we don't catch most bank robbers after the first bank robbery, right? We catch them after the 17th. And so would I open an investigation? I think there's sufficient predication. I think I would be concerned that this was not the first instance. I don't know that that necessarily means people are prosecuted or charged or convicted or tried or sentenced. I don't know if any of that is true, but I would also want to do damage mitigation. I mean, you know that world well from your time in the intelligence community.
No, look,
what got out? Where did it go? Who has it?
I feel very strongly about this because we have highly confidential, top secret information. When we develop attack plans, those are the most sensitive information you can have, and it's always top secret. And when we discussed attack plans, we went to the Situation Room in the White House. We didn't talk about it through our cell phones, for God's sakes. And so when they were talking on an open line with a journalist on top of that who's been admitted to the group, the danger is that that information could leak, and then if it's leaked to Yemen, they're going to not only destroy the mission, the attack plan, they're going to kill men and women in uniform, particularly those on the carriers and Navy vessels. So this is a dangerous situation to have that kind of leak.
And so if the question to me is, would an investigation be properly predicated? Would it be appropriate to investigate? Absolutely. That doesn't mean people are going to jail. But again, did someone screenshot it? Does someone else have it? Are there other conversations out there? I mean, I have 1,000 questions. I would ask the FBI to help me answer them.
I think there's a prefatory question to pose. I don't know the law in this area. What is a criminal case requires intent? So what is the standard of intent that must be met to make the case? And if, for example, it is the intent to, the willful intent to disclose national secrets to an individual who is otherwise not privy to them, that is a high threshold. And the question I would then have is, does this warrant a criminal investigation, or does it warrant an investigation to understand how this occurred? Does it occur on other occasions? Who else received the information, and how do we remediate? And how do we ensure that it doesn't happen again? So does it warrant study and remediation? Most certainly. Should that be a criminal investigation? I think is a distinct question. I'd want to know more before
I don't think you can
launch
answer that question
Before you investigate.
before you investigate.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that's true, but who
but
is
I'd
the
al-
investigator?
But I would also tell you that under the relevant statute, so I think it's 18 U.S.C. 793 or 798, something like that, reckless
Here's the mens rea.
mishandling would be sufficient
Yeah,
to
it
constitute a
violates
crime.
security law.
Well, then the criminal investigation may be warranted.
But I don't want
if the standard is recklessness.
But to Janet's point, I think, I'd be careful about flipping the inquiry, right? We don't know until we investigate whether it was intentional. It may not be, so we don't prosecute.
But, look, as a former chief of staff, I would have said to the president, I'm sorry, we've got to investigate this. Whether we have the FBI investigate it or whether we have intelligence people
Correct.
investigate it, it's got to be investigated to determine who screwed up.
Agreed.
Because that person, whoever screwed up, has to be held accountable and frankly ought to be fired.
Agreed. In my
But maybe not prosecuted.
Yeah. And where is congressional oversight on this? I mean, you have the Senate Intelligence Committee, you have the House Intelligence Committee.
Exactly.
It seems to me that not only should the president have initiated an internal investigation for his own administrative good, but this seems to me to be an appropriate subject for the Congress to do oversight on, and for them to just take a pass and say, well, we're going to throw it over to the IG, and who knows when the IG will come up with anything, et cetera. That seemed to me yet again another instance where Congress is not standing up for its own authority.
So if the Biden National Security Team had done this,
Oh, there'd been oversight up the wazoo.
yeah.
What are your thoughts on limiting terms on the Supreme Court?
Well, I was involved in a panel discussion on that. I would say it's possible to do so. It has to be done so it phases in the future. It's not going to pass if we're going to kick people off the current court and change the rules. But you could possibly carefully construct, to me, some sort of term limit in the future, but it would require a constitutional amendment.
It would require a constitutional amendment.
Constitution says you should serve for good behavior, and that's what it's always been interpreted, and I don't think the courts are going to see it otherwise.
Well, but I would say I agree with you, Senator. I think that of all the ideas for court reform that have come around, to me, the most logical and I think necessary is some sort of term for the Supreme Court.
I kind of came slowly to that view. It just can't be done right now because people have got partisan political views, and if you're undermining their, I'm sure the Democrats wouldn't have done it when they had the majority in the court, and the Republicans not going to do it now.
What's
But
interesting,
if you could do it in the future far enough, I think it would.
it would require a constitutional amendment, which is extraordinarily hard to do. What is interesting, however, is that the number of justices on the Supreme Court are set by statute. And the size of the Supreme Court has ranged over the history, our history, from as little as 6 to as many as 11. So you don't need an amendment to put more justices on, but you would need an amendment to kick a few of them off.
Politically, do you think if both parties agreed on a term limit thing, I think it could get
both
the
parties.
constitutional amendment. I believe it might
Both
pass.
parties agreed.
Well, isn't it
a big if.
two-thirds of both parties and three-quarters of the states?
Yeah.
That's true.
That's a big number.
That's
It's a big number,
hurdle.
however,
Big hurdle.
I don't know that I think a lot of people would be for that, both parties.
Speaking of the Constitution, the president is talking about a third term. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution says, and I quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice," unquote. Is a third term unconstitutional?
Well,
Not gonna happen,
yes, it is, but I hope Trump keeps talking about it because it's just going to bottle up all the other Republican candidates that want to run in 28. So, you know. That's my thinking.
Chuck, what do you think?
It's absolutely unconstitutional. I think a lot of our time has been spent on it, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Should there be
I agree.
Should there be limits on the power of pardon? The pardon is a pretty broad power, and there's been concerns about how President Biden used it for preemptive pardons, and how President Trump used it, particularly to pardon the people involved in January 6th. Should there be limits put on the power of pardon, or is that even possible? Alec?
What type of limits would we be talking about? It'd be very difficult to define limits on that type of authority.
I agree.
It's a question in the abstract. I haven't seen proposals as to how that authority would be limited, but it certainly is an authority that has been abused on both sides of the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
Is it constitutional to deport prisoners to prisons in other countries?
I think we'll see that litigated pretty soon. But I'd like to go to the situation we now have where individuals who were characterized as members of a Venezuelan gang were picked up and deported to El Salvador with no opportunity to say, I am not a member of a gang. I've never been a member of a gang. I'm actually trying to avoid being a victim of that gang. No opportunity for them to contest that characterization. And now they're in a foreign land with apparently no rights there at all. And I think that raises some basic due process issues that we all ought to be concerned with.
There's, with 200-year-old legislation being used for modern situations, should congressional legislation have an end date? Yeah, no, usually,
I don't think.
well, in other words,
Like a
when
sunset
Congress
provision?
passes something, should it?
Well, sometimes it does have a
Yeah,
sunset.
sometimes
It
it has a
does.
sunset.
It does have end
I think
dates.
some of the FISA amendments had sunset provisions.
Well,
they
and it terminates as a result of that. Usually there's a limitation, like tax cuts. That usually has an end date. That's why we're
also-
talking about
I think
tax
we are
cuts.
also within our prerogative to hope that lawmakers will change the law when the law is no longer applicable to the times. They have the authority.
On the 10-year budget, on the 10-year tax cuts, that was because under the Budget Act, you could pass 10 years worth of tax cuts, but no more, without being subjected to a filibuster. So this is how complex the rules get.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
become very complex about what you can pass through a budget without being subject to a filibuster.
What is the law and order red line? that if Trump crossed it, would result in impeachment and removal from office.
Impeachment again, you know?
Yeah.
The man is who he is. He's going to push limits, and sometimes he's going to get over them. Sometimes he's going to get slapped back by the courts.
You know, I
We
agree.
can't have impeachment every time we have a disagreement politically.
I agree with the general. The problem, I mean, there is no real way to answer that question because an impeachable offense is what Congress says it is. I mean,
Basically.
it's high crimes and misdemeanors. And, you know, you can ask legal scholars to debate the precise meaning of that and literally never get an answer. And so it is whatever Congress says it is at the time, depending on the composition of the two chambers.
Jeff,
Well, but that doesn't remove the moral responsibility of Congress to consider seriously whether this is an impeachable offense under the thought processes of the writers of the Constitution.
But it's a flexible stem.
I know, but it is not controlled, I admit. But I didn't like it many times when people talk about impeachment. It can just be anything. It cannot be just anything if you're a good congressman or a senator.
Jeff, you've been in the cabinet, I've been in the cabinet. Do presidents need guardrails? Each of the presidents I worked for wanted strong advisors in the room to speak their minds, even if they disagreed with the president. Most presidents need that kind of guidance and restraint in order to avoid making serious mistakes. In his first term, Trump had guardrails. People like Mike Pompeo, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, Jeff Sessions, others. In this term, the president deliberately wanted to avoid those that might tell him he was wrong. He wants to operate by his instincts and his guts. Should he have strong advisors and guardrails? Otherwise, isn't the nation at greater risk? Jeff?
I think you should have people who understand the complexities of some of these issues. I don't believe it gets up to the president, for example, the negative thoughts that were involved in Afghanistan. I don't think he really had some really serious people who lived in Afghanistan who could tell you this could be a real problem.
Yeah,
this might not work out.
I don't think he
Are you
wanted to hear
sure? He probably didn't want to hear it. And so, yes, I do think it's important, and the president will be operating at risk if he does not get really tough, smart advice from people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Why do you think he went that way this second term, in terms of not having people in his inner circle that are guardrails?
Well, I don't know how they are in the inner circle, except he was looking for people who could take his case, I think. I don't know. I hadn't talked to him. But I think he was looking for people that could help him advance his message politically on TV and carry the agenda and not be, inside the detail-oriented and not able to project his mission. And that could create some risk of not having sufficient depth of expertise.
Yes, indeed. We're in the final minutes here. Let me ask each of you, obviously, a lot of challenging issues, a lot of things that we've talked about that are of concern to the American people, a lot of concern about our democracy and the survival of our democracy. When you look at the present situation today in this country, does it make you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the country? Alec, let me start with you.
I would say it makes me very concerned about where we are, but I remain optimistic. Even though democracy is an experiment, and a very young one at that, I have confidence in the resilience of our country and its people.
Janet?
So, looking at American history, we have had other periods like this. For example, the period 1917 to 1921, lots of domestic violence, lots of immigration actions and deportation actions being taken, very similar to what's happening today, very vituperative politics, et cetera. You know, it was Wilson, it was Warren Harding, and it was Calvin Coolidge. But we came out of that ultimately. It took electing a president in the midst of a crisis, the Great Depression, and we really didn't get out of it until we were attacked at Pearl Harbor and joined World War II, and still under the same president. But we came out of it, and we came out of it even stronger. And so I am guardedly optimistic, but I am concerned that we are not yet at the point where change will happen.
Chuck?
To add to Janet's list, I mean, the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, the internment of Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, McCarthyism, the 60s, and we came out of all of that too. I agree with Ali, we are resilient. I believe our most important institution, right now I believe it is the courts, will hold, and I am an optimist. Maybe dead wrong, but I'm an optimist.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about it. It's a raucous, one time Mitch McConnell called it a teeming cauldron of competing ideas. It's what we are. And I've learned to be more accepting to the diversity of arguments that we hear. I don't think this is that great. I think the people who are tired are not that much different than some of the other stress periods. The American people want this government to be leaner, more effective, and protect them more. And the president was elected on that promise. He's not a lawyer. He's pushing very, very hard. And if he goes over the line, I think he'll be brought back. So, yeah, and the Constitution preserves our prosperity as well as our liberty. It's still strong. Chuck just quoted some of the things that we follow to this day, word for word, because they're in the Constitution, and we do not need to lose it, and I don't think we will.
Well, I share the view that, you know, I remain confident about the future of our country. Why? Because of all of you, because of the power of the people in a democracy. And I think we have to understand that it is the power of the people that ultimately can sway people. If people are concerned, if people speak their minds, if people organize, if people vote, then we'll protect our democracy. And most importantly, if people are informed about the issues that we deal with in a democracy. I am absolutely convinced that this is a country of, by, and for people for a reason, because people are the ultimate check as to whether our democracy will survive or not. And that's why we do this program, and that's why I thank all of you for participating. Would you please thank our speakers? Thank you. Good job.